In 1993, I was already old enough to begin appreciating the entertainment that video games could offer. I remember my first introduction to them through an older cousin, who would obsessively play on his Sega Megadrive, or Genesis for Americans, for what seemed like 24 hours a day, and I was more than happy to go to his house daily after school and literally sit there for hours watching it. He never gave up his controller for others to actually have a go, but that didn't matter to me at the time, and probably set up my guilty pleasure of watching YouTube Let's Plays of various video games to this day. He loved his fighting games, and although I've never been able to play these with any proper skill, I remember absolutely loving the locations and detailed backdrops these games would take place in. The infamous Street Fighter, for example, would pit players off against each other in global locations such as a busy Chinese market, Buddhist temples, American military bases, Hindu shrines, pubs, taverns, and it was the same with the likes of other popular fighting games of the time too, such as Mortal Kombat, but in a much darker sense. These games didn't feel like mindless beat-em-ups, despite the disapproving uproar at the time from some sectors of society.
Fantasy martial arts game, as some parents think is just too violent.
It's called Mortal Kombat. Cold-blooded murder is making Mortal Kombat the most popular video game in history.
Kids who play a lot are frustrated, they're anxious, they have a lot of problems with communication.
In some sections of the city, we have a machine or two machines and sometimes three machines in virtually every single corner store in a neighborhood.
For parents who can't believe the game makers are fantasizing about decapitation.
Fear expressed by parents during public hearings that video games lead to violence.
Senior citizens have rights. They have rights to go into the laundromat and wash their laundry in peace. They don't have to go by two or three machines or kids congregating and passing fast remarks as they walk in.
There's not a lot going on mentally. It's the same repeated movement over and over and over again, and it's very hypnotic.
There really was a feeling of globe-trotting, a cultural exposure for the player happening on a deeper, conscious level, which was quite mind-expanding in its own subtle way for young people at the time, a theme I'll return to throughout this series. Probably the single most appealing game for me at the time though was Sonic the Hedgehog. By the time I was old enough to play video games myself, Sonic the Hedgehog had already had 3 main series games, plus a whole bunch of spin-off titles, with Sonic and Knuckles being the most recent during that time in my life. As a side note, and a bit of foreshadowing of the games I'll cover in the series later, I have noticed that if I drop into a modern game series with a sequel, I don't necessarily feel inclined to revisit previous entries of the series half as much as during the 90s era of video games. Perhaps it's just me, but there's something about the constant and quite often dramatic rejigging of the game engine, the graphics engine and play mechanics that breaks a sense of paced, progressive evolution of a video game series nowadays. This, I feel, perhaps in all honesty, due to hardware limitations at the time, was not something that occurred quite so dramatically with older games, unless the next in the series came out on a next-gen system, in which the dramatic change felt justified. I fully understand and appreciate that game series need to develop, grow, mature and change, which I'm all for if done correctly, but I do prefer a sense of consistency in the general design and concept. To feel the whole series as a self-actualizing entity of its own. Otherwise I assume the developers' confidence in their previous iterations is quite low and probably not worth revisiting myself. Again, it's just my opinion. Back to Sonic. Sonic's first major outing was in 1991 with the self-titled Sonic the Hedgehog, or as I prefer, Sonic 1. By the end of 1994, Sonic 3 and its second half Sonic and Knuckles had been released, and there was a strong trilogy of games here. Sonic 1 was subtle in the way that it captured a lot of themes in the political and cultural ether at the time. The villain is Dr. Ivar Robotnik, or Eggman, a name largely exclusive for Japanese audiences back then. A maniac mad scientist whose vision is to convert all living creatures into mindless robots to prop up his empire. Robotnik's vision and even his name captured an underlying Western fear of the Soviet Union.
And debases the individual to a part of the vast machine that powers the state.
With his twisted utopian social vision, which would soon turn out to be dystopian. The name Robotnik, think Sputnik, and his bright red suit. This is probably why the name was changed from Eggman, which likely appealed to the cartoony or cutesy nature of Japanese pop culture. Sonic himself as a character referenced Western pop culture too, with his slick, cool kid with attitude personality. The themes found within the game of nature versus industry were ideas and movements that had exploded into the mainstream following the environmentalist warnings of the dangers of industry moving from the 60s subculture into the 80s mainstream. Even Blade Runner is heavily referenced as an influence. Just listen to this. Rat Brain is a massive reflection of the dystopian world proposed in the Blade Runner film, and Robotnik's vision is not too dissimilar to that of the mysterious Tyrell Corporation. A world of robot slaves that can be exploited for the purpose of its own narrow vision. Sonic the Hedgehog represented the youth generation rising up against the potentially lethal and misguided values of the conservative old. I've already mentioned that it took heavy influence from the explosion of the 60s environmentalist message, but there is much more wrapped up in the layers of this video game. Sonic wants his animal friends to be liberated, to be themselves, without the constraints of being locked in a robot shell, mindlessly carrying out the bidding of their dictator Robotnik. This in itself was the message of the 60s subculture. Be free, be authentic, release yourselves from the shackle of oppressive and imposed social structures. Throughout the game, Sonic has to collect Chaos Emeralds. The colours of these reflect the chakras found in Hindu mythology, which heavily influenced much of the 60s counterculture and subsequent New Age movement. The Chaos Emeralds themselves are found in special stages, which look like floaty, rotating, colourful transcendental states, with morphing animal totems in the background. For anybody who has ever taken LSD, it seems obvious where the influence likely comes from. The whole point of Sonic the Hedgehog as a game was to both mimic but differentiate itself from Nintendo's Mario, a character mascot who aided Nintendo's explosion into the mainstream and had already taken the industry of video games by storm. Mario had wide appeal and Sega wanted a slice of the cake. Like Mario, whose premise centres around the use of mushrooms for power, clearly a reference to mushrooms and psilocybin ingestion which influenced the 60s counterculture too. The creators of Sonic wanted to capture the essence of this in their own form. Since the illegalization of mind-altering psychedelics in the 60s and 70s, many within the counterculture went into the computer industry with the belief that computers were the next best thing. More recently, there has been a resurgence of virtual reality headsets such as the PlayStation VR and Oculus Rift. But this technology was the vision of the future for many of the hippies that were forced to abandon psychedelics in favour of a virtual altered state of consciousness. The infamous counterculture figure Timothy Leary.
Turn on, tune in, and drop out.
Was a huge proponent of the use of computers for the future, and even went as far as to design his own video game Mind Mirror. These people, often dismissed by conservatives as naive drug-taking hippies.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
Quite possibly designed the blueprint for today's culture and society without anybody fully noticing. Sonic Team, the creators of Sonic the Hedgehog, clearly had, at least to some degree whether conscious or not, turned on and tuned in. because what Sonic did to really stand out from Mario was create a game world that attempted to manifest a three-dimensional feel on a 2D plane. It's ironic that the moment console technology had the ability to facilitate 3 dimensions, that Sonic the Hedgehog has struggled immensely as a series, because I have no doubt in my mind that had the technology been available in 1991, the developers of Sonic would have aimed to create the game in 3 dimensions for this reason. The movie Tron had captured the sentiments of the progressive counterculture kids who had gone into computers. In this movie, Kevin Flynn, a software engineer and ex-employee of a technological conglomerate called Encom, helps create and physically enters into a whole new virtual computer world. This virtual world is an attempt to reflect the trajectory and overall potential of virtual reality itself. A manufactured simulation that can provide our wildest dreams or our worst nightmares on demand. A theme revisited many times, not least in the movie The Matrix. Sonic the Hedgehog attempted to manufacture a virtual 3-dimensional looking world like this, an altered state of consciousness, something the player could truly immerse themselves in and almost feel the texture and transcend their day-to-day lives by playing the game. Look at the sheer amount of detail put into not only the sprite work to recreate the look of 3D, but the light shading, the animation and the parallax scrolling for the moving background. The infamous Green Hill Zone, which is the first level of the game, was sheer propaganda for the series to come, showing off these software feats, at least for the time, in full, and hoping to overshadow the rather flat by comparison style of Mario. Sonic the Hedgehog as a series went on to expand upon these traits with the next 2 sequels. Sonic 2 and 3 took influence again from iconic pop culture movies such as Star Wars, expanding upon Sonic's defining characteristic in speed, and created lush, often psychedelic stages, almost always attempting a 3-dimensional look. The special stages, the foundations for the trippiest aspects of Sonic, became pseudo 3-dimensional in their attempt to get really surreal and transcendentally immersive for the player. This type of style was not exclusive to Sonic though. Many Megadrive games attempted to capture the neo-psychedelic effects of 3D. As a side note, the 60s counterculture was heavily influenced by historical Eastern spirituality. A kind of East-West merge and an appropriation in many instances had begun to take place. The same themes of this merge apply to many early 90s video games. Both Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat mentioned earlier primarily focused on Asian locations in addition to American ones. Shinobi focused on the story of Ninja Joe Musashi, taking on a criminal organisation called the Z. Again, the game's plot and level structure moves through locations such as Japanese dojos to American military installations. Sega was able to pitch itself as cool and youthful by comparison to Nintendo's consoles, almost like the popular corporate version of the 1960s subculture, because Nintendo's games were often very different in their style, grittier, flatter, even gothic and Giga-esque. You could say that Sega were the Beatles to Nintendo being the Rolling Stones, or more in line with the music of the time, Sega were the Happy Mondays to Nintendo being Joy Division. In fact, many of Sega's games seemingly took influence from the rise of rave culture in the late 80s too, which was renowned for the use of psychotropic drugs such as MDMA, which would create somewhat similar experiences to the psychedelics more commonly used in the 60s. Anybody who has played Streets of Rage will appreciate the perfect fit between the game's seedy, Tarantino-esque storyline. Even the game's villain Mr. X looks like John Travolta in Pulp Fiction, and the bright, flashing club-like atmosphere. The soundtrack to this game captures the rave influence perfectly, and Yuzo Koshiro knew exactly what he was doing in creating these tracks. This style has become something of an 80s, 90s nostalgia resurgence in recent years, with films such as The Guest, Drive, and the whole synthwave music genre, which ironically uses 90s video game soundtracks for influence. Overall, it seems that video games, primarily those on the Megadrive, were largely attempting to recreate 3D-like psychotropic experiences that the software developers probably had back in their youth, or at least absorbing through the popular culture of their own childhoods. Even though many mainstream video games were developed in Japan at the time, there has always been a strong link within the industry between departments in both the East and the West, and Japanese pop culture has always taken influence from a lot of American culture to build upon. Many games of the time attempted three-dimensional sprites, but I believe this wasn't merely because they wanted to superficially create 3D games, but couldn't due to technological limitations, but because 3D was a simulation of an altered state of consciousness that had been previously accessed through the now illegalized psychotropic drugs. This 3D altered state is a trend that has continued to this day, and will continue to with the rise of virtual reality headsets and massive open world games that the player can fully immerse themselves into, such as Grand Theft Auto or Skyrim. Players can even build their own virtual worlds now, such as in The Sims or the insanely popular Minecraft. 3D looking sprites and animation were used in such a surreal and abstract manner that it's absurd to even think that the developers were trying to be realistic and mimic everyday reality. Just look at Zool or Echa the Dolphin for example. These games attempted 3D. They wanted to offer the player an experience beyond their mundane day-to-day lives. Echo, a game about a dolphin trying to overthrow an alien invasion, has some interesting parallels to the character Howard in the infamous 70s counterculture novel Illuminatus by Robert Shee and Robert Anton Wilson. Not only that, but Echo the Dolphin's entire plot was very likely influenced by the experiments of Professor John Liller, inventor of the isolation tank, who was determined to demonstrate that humans could communicate with dolphins telepathically, hence Echo's eponymous communication style, and that alien entities of a higher consciousness existed in the star system Sirius, a common idea in more fringe counterculture circles. The general 90s pop culture introduced the mainstream population to ideas not previously considered outside the fringes of counterculture circles. Aliens, government conspiracies, genetic manipulation, cloning and artificial intelligence. TV series such as The X-Files and Stargate, as well as movies such as The Terminator, Aliens, and even Men in Black, were massively aided by the experiences of video games offered in their playable counterparts at the time. This was truly a consciousness revolution in many ways, and that is why the people sometimes refer to the 90s as the 60s Part 2. Video games were cool and hip, and young people fell in love with them as brand new conscious experiences. Now the video game industry is well and truly integrated within mainstream capitalism, and the world is ever more influenced by them in various ways. Next time, I'll be looking at the move from 2D to genuine 3D, primarily on the Sony PlayStation. Until then, goodbye.